it also is extremely personal. And I think those of us who care for someone with dementia feel as though it's unique to us, even though we know it isn't. So I would like to share this brief essay that I wrote about my mother, who died about a year and a half ago, having lived with dementia for about 7 or 8 years before that. I wrote this, and it's in the present tense because I wrote it during that early stage where she wasn't quite yet diagnosed, but we knew that she was failing. And that's why I'm so in support of Bill 827, because I think had her caregivers had better resources and knowledge, we might have been able to get her on some medicine earlier and some treatment, and it would have slowed the process. As it was really too late for her, so it's a terribly important bill. So I beg your indulgence while I read this. It's about 5 minutes. It's called Fugue State. In the dream, I am at the end of a pier enveloped in dense fog. My mother is in a small rowboat just below, in water that is completely still. I can hear her paddles slip beneath the water's surface and out again. It seems she is using her hands, too, to try to steady the boat, which spins listlessly in a circle. I can hear her breathing heavily and sighing, but I cannot see her or reach her, and I am powerless to help her. Of course, this is not a dream at all, but it is the fugue state in which we both now exist because she is in the early stages of dementia. Her doctors cannot prove it clinically. My mother keeps passing the simple 10-question dementia test easily. What year is it? Who is the president? Count backwards from 10. My mother tells the doctor, I'm insulted by these inane questions. But when we get back into the car, she asks me where we are and why, and when we'll be joined by my father, who died 15 years ago. Despite the lack of clinical proof, the telltale signs are there. She has stains all over her clothes because she can't operate the laundry machines. She will eat only white things, like potatoes and rice and milk. I keep finding unpaid bills hidden in the cedar-handled Bermuda bag she hasn't used since 1960. We discovered she hasn't paid car taxes or insurance in those years because when I questioned her, she said, insurance is stupid. This woman who taught me how to spell, how to handle money, and when I was 10 years old kept me out of school to protest the Vietnam War, can no longer run a comb through her own hair. Social workers and geriatric specialists have certain catchphrases, a kind of shorthand they use to describe the phenomenon of dementia. Your elder means the old person you still love, but who is increasingly becoming a stranger and who tries your patience. In most cultures, elder connotes the wisdom and perspective that come with a long life fully lived. But dementia robs old people of wisdom, even as it makes them infantile, petty, and inward turning. The same woman who made sure we wore our Arctics and wool hats on our walk to school every day now cranks up the heat to 80 degrees in her apartment, wanders around in a summer t-shirt complaining of the cold. She has simply forgotten that in winter in New England one wears a sweater. Cognitive impairment is a less threatening way of saying dementia, but it doesn't fully capture what it means to lose one's marbles. On Halloween, my mother wished me Happy New Year. For a time was convinced people were crawling in her window at night, and is frequently afflicted with aphasia, stammering and concentrating hard on a word, and then shaking her head and letting it go. The person I most trusted with my own children when they were babies now thinks they are her sons-in-law, and soon will not recognize them at all, despite the framed photos of them everywhere in her room. Therapeutic lying is the practice of deflecting conflict. One can never win an argument with a person with dementia, and there's no point in trying to set the record straight. The record shifts and mutates as a phantasm in a sandstorm. Better to simply agree and say, Dad will visit you tomorrow. Clinically, dementia is the progressive dying out of certain regions of the brain, like a house in which light bulbs begin to arc and flicker and then eventually burn out. But I have come to see dementia as a kind of horse, galloping home towards some inevitable stable, while my mother does her best to stay in the saddle, clinging to the reins as they thrash about in her hands. There are predictable stages the old person goes through. There is the period of terrifying and inexplicable rage. I remember 3 times watching my mother's face, once so lovely and comforting, suddenly contort until she resembled nothing so much as an evil jack-o'-lantern. When I mentioned this to her doctor, she soberly advised me to remove the knives from my mother's kitchen. Then that phase seemed to pass and change into a kind of sorrowing lament. My mother began to refuse the rides we took through the countryside because the trees along the highway frightened her. She wanted only to go home to the facility she hates. After the sorrow comes a kind of childlike acquiescence, which, while easier to handle than anger or depression, brings its own despair to the family caregivers. The woman who taught me so much of what I know about being a parent now looks to me for help turning a key, buttoning a blouse, dialing a number on the phone she no longer remembers how to use to call a person whose face she no longer recognizes. When you teach these skills to a child, it's done in anticipation of the forward trajectory that leads to reading, riding a bike, perhaps college, and ultimately independence. But trying to reteach one's own parent these skills just accentuates the slipping away of everything that person once knew and was. For dementia is, first and foremost, a disease of loss. Like some twisted version of the poet Elizabeth Bishop's great villanelle, first the car goes, then the home, the ability to cook safely, to manage one's own money, to control the bowels, to walk, even the instinct to swallow. Some people with dementia die simply because they forget how to eat, and it is too labor-intensive for the round-the-clock caretaker to massage the pureed food down the gullet as a mother bird does with her young. My mother is not at that stage yet. Right now, we are worried about her bolting, or in clinical terms, wandering. Again, the terminology evokes some wise journey of self-knowledge, the walkabout or the vision quest. But old people do not set out Thoreau-like for a transcendental epiphany. Instead, they are looking for their long-dead parent, or perhaps friends from a disbanded bridge club, or simply a missing sock. They get lost in the woods and die of hypothermia, or wander into a dark road and get hit by a car, or in more dangerous neighborhoods, mugged. Perhaps if my mother does escape the facility, she will find her way to the river, which is quite nearby. If there is a dock, she may walk to the end of it. Perhaps she will find me in a small boat there and will encourage me in the strong, young voice she once had to jump in. Perhaps she will teach me how to swim, how not to be afraid of the fog rolling in. I urge all my colleagues to support this wonderful bill. Thank you.